This is week 3 of the college baseball rankings. Let's get into it. I think, without a doubt, there's not going to be much movement in the top 10. We can both agree on that for sure. For me specifically, I believe the top 9 teams from last week all stayed in the same spot. We can run through those, but how does that look for you?
Yeah, it is the same for me as well. Top 9 all staying in the same spots. A lot of these teams just played some pretty low-level competition and took care of business. I think the only ones that really had impressive series wins were Louisville and Florida, both taking some good quality wins. Outside of that, there wasn't really a whole lot of notable games, and that's why we see a lot of these teams staying here. They're just winning easy games.
Yeah, we also saw Ole Miss beat what was then ranked Maryland. Little foreshadowing, they're not going to be ranked. They've just been losing a lot of games. But yeah, for me, top 9, which I'll run through real quick. LSU at 1, Wake Forest at 2, Stanford 3, Tennessee 4, Arkansas 5, Ole Miss 6, Louisville 7, Vanderbilt 8, and Florida at 9 all stayed in the same spots. Florida had a little bit of trouble midweek. They lost to they went 1-1 in midweek and then won the series against Miami. So good enough. They were 3-2 to stay in that spot, especially because the teams right behind them struggled a little bit. East Carolina was at the 10 spot, went 2-2 with a midweek loss at Duke, and then struggled a bit over the weekend, losing to Long Beach State, which was the only other really good team that they played over the weekend in the tournament they were in. So for me personally, I dropped them back and had another team jump them.
Yeah, same for me there. Not a terrible week for East Carolina, but like you said, it wasn't good. The two best teams they played this week, they lost to. And as a result, I moved Virginia Tech up into this 10 spot after their impressive sweep over Charlotte, who is the Conference USA favorite coming into this year. So, really quality series win for them, especially completing the sweep. And I think up to this point, they've just looked like a better team than East Carolina so far.
Yeah, I had Texas A&M jumping into the 10th spot just because they were in 11 before and they had a pretty good week, kind of a redemption week from last week. Even though one of their wins was in 16 innings against Texas Tech, they had a pretty competitive game against Louisville and won their other 2 games that were against a little bit lesser opponents. And they went 3-1. So I think just because they've faced probably better opponents, that's kind of why I gave them the edge over like a team like Virginia Tech, who, yeah, they faced Charlotte, which has been a good team over the past few years. We haven't really seen that yet, with their record being like around 500. But I think, yeah, it's definitely reasonable for either of these teams to be right in that area.
Yeah, and you do have to give Texas A&M a little benefit of the doubt just because of how highly ranked they were coming into the year. They had that terrible week last week facing Portland at home, but I mean, it with a lot of teams early in the year, they're just not firing on all cylinders. And after them looking better against some more solid competition this week, we can kind of assume that it was just kind of an off week for them.
Yeah, so what do you think in the 10th spot?
I'm fine with Texas A&M going there. I think I would also like to see Virginia Tech jump East Carolina though.
Okay, so we can go Texas A&M at 10, and then 11 Virginia Tech, and then I don't really want to drop East Carolina that far back just because they have looked pretty good beating North Carolina last week, and they still were decent. They still went 2-2 and faced relatively tough competition. So,
I'd agree.
and then in the 13th spot, we had Virginia last week. I think they deserve to stay in that spot. They're 11-0. We're 4-0 this week. Offense has been dominant against lesser opposition, and yeah, we haven't really seen them face any good teams yet, but they're getting everything done and haven't lost yet, so not really any question marks yet.
Yeah, and these 13, 14, 15 spots, Virginia, UCLA, and North Carolina, all three just went undefeated on the week. And like you mentioned, just took care of business against lower level competition. Nothing really that impressive, but they're just winning games. And I left all three of these in the same spot here.
Yeah, I think out of those three, UCLA was probably the most impressive since they beat USC, who's a rival, and they can be decent some years. And then Sac State has also looked like they're a pretty decent team. So for UCLA to come out and sweep the weekend is pretty good, but there's just no room to really move up here. But yeah, so those three in the same spot. After that, there's a few teams that could move around a bit, with Florida State being in that 16th spot last week. They went 2-2, won their midweek against USF, but lost the series to Florida Gulf Coast over the weekend, and it was at home as well. Even though this week all their games were pretty close, you kind of want them to be able to beat a team like Florida Gulf Coast to stay ranked and be going against top competition, and seeing them do well the week before. It's kind of inconsistencies like that you don't really like to see for a team like that.
Yeah, definitely not what we expected after last week, them going on the road in Fort Worth and taking down TCU. Thought they would be able to win at least 3 games this week against some not incredible competition, but just splitting, it's not the end of the world, but it's not great. And they're definitely going to drop some spots here just because a lot of teams in this little mid range here just won out throughout the week.
Yeah, it's tough because last week we had TCU right behind them, so it's tough to have them get jumped by them, but that is definitely the case here. I had TCU in that 16 spot. I don't know what your opinions are on that.
Yeah, I also had TCU moving up, and then Oklahoma State, who was right behind them, I had coming in at that 17 spot as well.
Sweet. And we've mentioned this before. Oklahoma State, they did lose pretty poorly early on, and we said that if they kind of get their groove back, then they could be jumping teams that maybe in other weeks you wouldn't really see. But Florida State jumping all the way up into the rankings last week because they had that amazing series win, now stuttering a bit and dropping back a few spots at least. So yeah, I'm good with Oklahoma State in that it's 17 spot as well. And then 18 is where I had Florida State, but I can see other teams right around the corner definitely competing for that spot. It's tough because Florida State has at least had one or two good weekends where they've faced good competitions. It's a little too early to tell if Florida Gulf Coast is the real deal. They've won a lot of their games, so they could be kind of on the fringe of being ranked if they have another good week against good opposition, but a little too early for that to know how good they are. But a lot of the teams at the back end of the rankings here just haven't really faced anybody yet. They're doing well, similar to Virginia, but it's just really tough to know if the competition is really there.
Yeah, I'm fine with leaving Florida State here as well. You just kind of got to nod the cap for them taking that series against TCU on the road. Like you mentioned, a lot of these teams at the lower end of the rankings just haven't played that great of competition. So you kind of like giving the benefit of the doubt to a team like Florida State, who has at least played some decent competition. And yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it wasn't a terrible week. It was a 2-2 split. And so I'm fine with just dropping them here at the 18 spot.
And then 19 and 20 last week were occupied by teams that did very poorly, with Maryland going 1-3, now an overall record of 4-7, and then Miami was in the 20 spot. Overall 8-4, so not terrible, but did go 1-3. They did face Florida, so you have to kind of take that with a grain of salt, but they did as well lose their midweek against Florida Atlantic, which might just really be the thing that puts them over the edge and not have them being ranked this week. So both of these teams for me are out of the rankings and opened up some spots for teams we haven't seen yet this year.
Yeah, Maryland has just absolutely shot themselves in the foot with their early season scheduling. They've just played a ton of tough competition every week, and they've paid the price with their record. They don't look terrible, but the record's not there, and at this point, you just can't have them in the rankings at 4-7. And then with Miami, that midweek is just an absolute killer. If you just go 1-2 on the week or 2-2 with a midweek win and a series loss to Florida, they're probably not dropping out of the rankings. They might just hang in there at like the 24-25 spot. But with that midweek loss, you just have to take them out at there with so many teams that are just winning most of their games throughout this point.
Yeah, going back to Maryland, you mentioned it. You love to see the ambitious schedule that they put up there, but just did not get enough to warrant staying ranked. And in that spot for me, I had NC State jumping up 2 from 21, just because they went 4-0 again, doesn't seem like it was great competition, but they're 12-0, haven't lost yet, similar to Virginia, like I mentioned.
Yep, I also had NC State jumping into this spot. They've looked quality in all their wins so far, and like you mentioned, they just haven't really played anyone, but they're winning every game. And it's the same story with Alabama, who I had slotted right behind them. Also had a 4-0 week and is 12-0 overall now. Both these teams have the same record, and they're just winning all their games against pretty poor teams.
Yep, I had the exact same notes, just same as NC State. 12-0. Can't really complain about that and deserve to go up in the rankings if there are spots open like that.
For sure.
And then at 21 is where I have my first new team jumping into the rankings, this being South Carolina. They're 11-1 overall, and they went 2-1 against Clemson this week. Not really sure how good this Clemson team is. It was a little bit iffy at the beginning because Clemson did win the first game of the series, so it seems like South Carolina was just on the fringe. We had them at 26 last week, and if they lost to that Clemson team, then it would have been a bit of a rough patch because they wouldn't have been able to get into the rankings for a while with so many teams just hunting for a spot.
Yeah, I also had South Carolina here. Like you mentioned, it looks like a quality series win over Clemson. We're not 100% sure how good this Clemson team is yet, but nonetheless, it was a good series win for South Carolina. We've seen some absolute fireworks from that offense so far this year. Won't really be able to tell how solid they are until we get into SEC play here, but they've dominated the early stretch of the season and deserve a nod into the top 25 here.
Yeah, if it's similar to how Clemson was last year, the talent is there. It's just kind of getting that consistency and getting the team to really gel together, which was really the problem. It just seems like one week they were amazing and then next week they get swept, which could be a similar storyline as it was. But yeah, South Carolina, you can't really put it past them. They've done their job. They got their first loss this week and still won the series. So jumping up to 21 there. And then after that, for me, I have Texas Tech. Even though they went 3-2 this week, those two games were their first losses of the year. They lost to Rice and Texas A&M, who we now jumped up to the 10 spot. And obviously, you can't really take that loss to A&M too harshly since it was in 16 innings and it was just an absolutely brutal game there. So that's why I left him in the same spot as we had last week. Just staying at 22, I think that's warranted just because they faced decent competition. They didn't do the best. Obviously, losing to Rice is a bit of a bummer. Beating Michigan, who has been in a lot of these tournaments and lost a lot of these games, but similarly to Maryland. But yeah, they don't seem like they're a bad team.
Yeah, and like you mentioned with Texas Tech, in addition to them losing in 16 innings to A&M, their loss to Rice was only a one-run game. Just neither loss was really that devastating, and those two midweek wins really picked them up for a 3-2 record on the week. I had them in this slot here as well. Still a very solid team, and like you mentioned, those were only their first two losses of the year so far.
And for these last three spots, we have Oregon State and Southern Miss, who both went 3-1. Looked pretty good. Definitely deserved to be ranked. And then the team that I had coming in is UC Irvine. They're 10-1 overall. They had a sweep at Arizona State, so they've looked really impressive. They've faced tough competition. They definitely deserve to be ranked. It's just kind of determining where each of these teams lies. For me, I just bumped up Oregon State and Southern Miss one spot and put UC Irvine at 25, but I could see that in a different spot as well.
Yeah, I actually did the exact same thing here. And like you said with UCI, they've faced some good competition so far. It's been a really impressive start to the season for them. In addition to that sweep against Arizona State, they swept Tulane as well. And they also have wins over Michigan and San Diego, which are also two quality wins. So definitely a hot start to the year for them. And we'll see how they do this upcoming weekend against Gonzaga as well, who's had a very tough start to the year.
Yeah, definitely. It'll be a good test because Gonzaga has faced some really good opponents, so they'll be used to playing against good teams. Obviously, they have lost the majority of those games, but I think they'll be at least ready to play tough competition, and UC Irvine has shown that they have been a very, very good team so far. So yeah, that rounds out the top 25. There are a few teams that are just right on the fringe, starting with teams like Campbell. They're 8-2. They've looked really good, really competitive. One of those mid-major teams that always seems to pop up in the rankings, and they've definitely been a very consistent team so far. It'll be interesting to see how the next few weeks go for them, and they can. I feel like a lot of these teams that we'll be talking about are like 1 week away. It seems like they're just like one good series win away from being ranked, as long as the teams that are ranked have some difficulties. But yeah, it's a lot of these teams have upcoming series that are also really important and are against good teams.
Yeah, it's just any of these teams in the 20 to 25 range cannot slip up because we got 5 to 10 teams just waiting to pounce. Teams that have looked good through the start of the year and, like you mentioned, are just really one quality series win away from jumping up into these rankings.
Yeah, similarly, we have GCU, also 8 wins. They have 3 losses, so one more. But they faced Texas State the last week, won the series, and have looked really good, faced decent competition as well. They are one of the teams to beat Tennessee, so that's always impressive. You put that on the radar there, even though it was in Arizona at their stadium. It's still a very quality win that you'll take any day of the week. Another team kind of similar to that is Iowa, 8-1 overall, where they were 3-0 over the weekend in a relatively bad tournament, I would say, one of the worst this weekend, but this week are going up against Texas Tech. So whoever wins that series is probably going to be ranked. They could both be if Texas Tech does well enough to stay ranked, but Iowa is definitely looking to pounce there and become a team that jumps into our rankings.
Yeah, another team to mention here as well is Santa Barbara, who the previous week had an impressive sweep on the road at Oregon, and then Oregon just bounced back with a 4-game sweep over San Diego. So that's another team that dropped out of our rankings, but potentially looking to get back in. Has a huge series with UCLA to start off conference play coming up. And yeah, just a lot of teams one series away from hopping up in here.
Yeah. Another team to mention would be Georgia Tech, even though they lost and it was kind of like a home and away situation with Georgia. This past week they lost the series 2-1, but those were the first 2 losses of their season. So they're definitely looking decent, and it looked like the first kind of actual competition they played, so they stumbled a bit, but or we haven't seen like a lot of these teams that are ranked face good competition, so it's just tough to know if they would stumble or not because they just haven't had that opportunity yet. So with conference play around the corner, it'll be interesting to see if all these teams that are undefeated and haven't really faced any good competition are all that, or if they're just going to drop out of the rankings right away, because we'll definitely be quick to pull the string on them if they kind of mess up a bit or stumble. So we also have Auburn and Florida Gulf Coast as teams that could potentially jump into the rankings if they have good weekends, and other teams around there also stumble a bit. Those teams are definitely looking like potential, probably around that 30 spot right now, but could move up a lot if they have good weekends.
Definitely.
Sweet. So you have anything else to mention, or are we just wrapping this up right now and we'll run down the rankings really quick?
Yeah, I think we covered quite a few of these teams that are lurking right outside, and yeah, we can wrap this up.
Sweet. So starting at the 25 spot, we have UC Irvine, then Southern Miss at 24, Oregon State 23, Texas Tech 22, at 21 South Carolina, then Alabama at 20, NC State at 19, Florida State at 18, Oklahoma State 17, TCU 16, UNC 15, UCLA 14, Virginia 13, East Carolina 12, Virginia Tech 11, Texas A&M 10, Florida at 9, Vandy 8, Louisville 7, Ole Miss 6, Arkansas 5, Tennessee 4, Stanford 3, Wake Forest 2, and LSU finishing up the top 25.